Give me about 10, 15 minutes talk, and then we can go and deal with questions. I'm unfortunately having to work off my memory here because we hadn't really thought this through clearly. Next time we'll make better prepared. And I would actually have brought a contract so you could all look at one. Now, keep in mind, every publisher's contracts are going to look somewhat different because there's no official standardized legal way to do a contract, and some of them can be immensely complex. I would have brought you a Bain contract because they're very simple, clear, straightforward, and you can actually understand them. First time I read one, I was surprised to realize I could understand the whole thing, except there were a few minor things I needed my agent to clarify for me. There are basically 6 things a contract is going to cover that are important. The first one is what's called the grant of rights. And what this is, it spells out exactly what they're buying. And typically this will be expressed as they're buying, by the way, I should back up. Everything I'm going to be talking about applies to books. I'm not going to get into short fiction. Short fiction things are different, and you don't get the same kind of complexity. The reason book contracts get long, and this is really the only reason they get long, or at least it's the only legitimate reason they get long, is because the publisher is buying the rights for a very long time. That's why a short fiction contract should be very short, because they're simply buying short-term rights. Anyway, the first item in the contract is what they call grant of rights, and what that is you're just simply agreeing that you will give them the right to sell the work anywhere in the world, or anywhere in English language, or anywhere in North America. It will specify what the range is of the rights that you're selling. As an author, you want to keep that as restricted as possible. So ideally, you want to simply be selling North American rights. You're almost always not going to have to sell North American rights because it's pretty hard to exclude Canada. But that's what you want, is North American rights. Failing that, you want to sell English language rights, or you're going to wind up selling world rights. The point about this, however, that's ideal, but when you're starting out and you're just in the process of getting established, and if it's a reputable publishing house, you're pretty well going to wind up having to accept whatever they offer. And don't make a big fuss over it. It's not worth it. If you have a good high-power agent and she or he thinks it's worth making a fuss over, let them do it. But if you don't, and most likely you'll probably be representing yourself, just accept it. There are things you can argue about, but grant of rights is usually pretty well fixed. Like I said, if you're well established, it's a different story. But if you're starting off, this is not something worth getting into a big brawl over. The next thing that will be established is the advance. And just so everyone understands, I can't assume everyone understands this, so if those of you who do, just bear with me. An advance is technically a no-interest loan. Essentially what's happening is the publishing house is lending you money with the royalties that will come from the sale of the book being the collateral for the advance, with the proviso that if the book doesn't earn out, which is the expression used, that is, if the royalties don't wind up being big enough to cover the entire advance, you don't have to pay it back. It's a very odd kind of loan. In other words, it's a no-interest loan, and the publisher's taking all the risk. There are some extreme circumstances in which a publisher will try to get an advance back, but there are things like with established authors, you typically do not sell. You don't typically write a book first and then sell it. You make a contract with the publisher to write a book, and they're buying that book when you do it, but you haven't written it yet. And there have been cases where authors take the money and then never write the book. And if the money involved is big enough, the publishing house might sue to get their money back. Typically they won't. Unless the money's really big, it's typically not worth it to them to hire a lawyer to try to get the money back. They'll just simply write it off as a loss, but you ain't going to get published.